Now that we've got our model built and basically UV unwrapped, it's time to do a little extra bit of Blender magic called baking in the ambient occlusion layer. This is actually the step above all others in the texturing process that will take your model from looking pretty good and fairly realistic to looking absolutely outstanding. And it's really simple. So I've got a screen up here with our 3D view on the right, our UV image editor on the left, and I'm just going to go over quickly how to get your ambient occlusion layer baked. So I'm going to select my object here in object mode. We already previously set up in the Blender setup tutorial how to get your samples set. I'm actually setting mine, I think I said 25 in that, and I'm being a bad boy and using 15, so let's move it up to 25. And then up at the top under our render tab here, little camera icon, you want to scroll down to the bake item, your bake panel, and under bake we want to choose ambient occlusion. And then basically just click the bake button. Now this step assumes that you've got a texture sheet already mapped to it. We do in this case, although it was just one of these built-in Blender internal sheets that we created, our color grid. But just because we had the color grid associated with the object, it will go ahead and use those settings and that size to create our ambient occlusion layer here. So we had the color grid set to 2048 by 2048, so our AO layer that we're baking now is going to be that same size when we save it out as an image. So on the left here you can see that it's starting to bake the object. It's taking into account the ground plane, our background image, and I found that that's really helpful to have a ground plane, even if it's just a flat colored plane. Even if you're not using a background image, put a ground plane in. It'll give you that sort of ground level ambient occlusion that makes such a difference in tying the object to the ground. Takes a few minutes to bake. I'll probably speed it up from here and just come back when the bake is done in a few minutes. Okay, so there you can see it's finished now. You can usually tell it's finished either by following the taskbar or the little progress bar at the top of the screen. You can also tell it's done when it adds in the padding around the edge of the AO at the very end of the process. And look at what we've got here as a result. I'm going to move that to one side. Even with no textures whatsoever on here yet, we've got a real sense of mass to the building. We've got that lovely interplay of shadow and light areas. You can see it really just goes a long way toward selling the whole impression of this as an actual 3D object, as an actual building, rather than just a collection of pixels. You know, we've got little details like on our inset doors here, we've got a little shadowing around the edges. You know, the door frames themselves are darkened. The corners really show it well. We've got shadowing on the roof here where it meets with this sort of extended section. Just all those things that go into making something look real. So going back over here to our UV image editor, this is a really important step. At this point you're in a very precarious position. The bake has happened. You've dedicated however minutes or God forbid hours, but usually it happens in just a matter of minutes to this bake. And yet what you're seeing on screen here is held strictly in memory in Blender right now. If I were to quit Blender without saving this file and then reopen it, we'd be back to the color grid again and we'd have to do the bake process all over. So once you're done with the bake, your first step is to make sure you save this out as an image so that you can then start using it with your texture set, and it'll save it externally to your Blender project here so you don't have to worry about losing it. So down at the bottom of the image editing window, just choose image. I just choose save a copy. You can choose save as image as well. And I save it as a PNG file. The JPEGs tend to be a little on the artifacty side, whereas the PNGs look good and work really well. They're very sort of lossless, I think. And let's just call it KPTX Firehouse AO PNG, and we'll save that as an image. And now we've got that, and we can use that as the basis to start building up our actual texture sheet in Photoshop. Before we get started working on our texture sheet, the other thing that I find is pretty helpful to have in general is to have a UV map that we can use as a layer in our Photoshop file too, which basically takes the UV shells and creates a layer that we can use in Photoshop to kind of act as a guide. And so to build that out, I'm going to go to my object here, go into edit mode. You can see in the UV image editor that we can see our UV shells here. Just select everybody, and under the UV menu at the bottom, click Export UV Layout. By the way, I said it was 2048 earlier. It's actually 4096 for our color grid, so everything that we bake out is kind of assuming those dimensions. But I'm going to make that smaller because we don't need a 4K texture sheet for this. So I'm going to put in 2048, leave it at PNG, and hit Export UV Layout. And that will, you'll see in a minute, that will make things a bit easier as well. Okay, so now it's time to go into Photoshop and start building up this texture. What I've done is created just a base texture 2048 square. Just filled it with a light gray so we can see both the light and the dark areas really easily when we start adding them in. And I'm going to start by opening the layer that we just baked, the UV shells, UV mapping. Let's see here. Alright, so here's our UV map. We're going to copy this, duplicate this layer into our, what is our untitled at the moment. So we're going to call that layer UV. Let's be neat about it. Uppercase UV. Alright, so we got that. Now we can use that. If we go to 100% view here, you can see it gives you a nice outline that you can use to reference when drawing in your textures. The next thing we're going to do is add in our ambient occlusion layer that we baked. And as I said, this is originally baked out at 4K. I've actually downsized it to 2K now. So do the same thing. You're going to click on that layer, hit duplicate layer, and put that on our untitled as well. Call that AO. I want to move the UV layer on top because we're actually going to be turning that off for a lot of our testing. And let's save this and call it KPTX Firehouse. Just save our PSD file. We want to go back over here into Blender, and we're going to set up a material that uses that. So we're going to click a new material. I like to give my material names the same name as the texture. It just kind of keeps things simple. I'm going to move my diffuse intensity all the way up to 1, my specular down to 0. That's just kind of something I do with most materials when I set them up. Most of the other parameters that you'll need, we don't need to worry about right now. We're not going to have any transparency for the moment. So that's set up, and then we need to, we'll assign that to our building. And then we'll go over to the adjacent texture tab here and actually use our texture that we just created, KPTX Firehouse. So that's going to be applied to the building. And then the last step is to go in the UV image editor here and actually choose that KPTX Firehouse.psd so you can see it actually applied to the building. Doesn't look much different right now because the image we just created in Photoshop looks pretty much like the AO layer did before, but this is now using our PSD for our image, for our texture mapping. And every time we save the PSD, we can just come back over here into Blender and reload that particular image and see it show up on our model. So the first thing we're going to do back in Photoshop is you might notice that our ambient occlusion layer is a little on the dark side. We wanted to add that shading, we want to add the dimensionality, but not necessarily to like dingy up the model to make it really dark and kind of somber looking. So I think what we're going to do is go to our AO layer. We need to adjust the levels, and you can do it one of two ways. You can do it interactive, or you can do it non-destructively by using an adjustment layer, or you can actually just hit Control L and adjust the levels in a destructive fashion for the AO. I think we're going to go non-destructive in this case because we might want to go back and sort of alter it and tweak it later on. So let's go in here. Don't pay attention to my dog. He's a maniac. And we're going to choose levels. And you can see from the histogram that there is very little of this AO image, AO layer, that's in the light portion of the histogram. And very little is fully dark. In fact, none that's fully dark. What we want to do is kind of bring the right-hand side, the light level, up to where it's right at the beginning of where the curves start. And I'm actually going to hit Alt on the boundary here and make the AO, make it so it applies just to the AO layer. So if you save that, you can see if we go back over into Blender, and in our image tab here, we hit the reload the source, that it just kind of brightens everything up a bit because our base that we're starting with is just this nice light gray. Oh, and the other thing we want to do, sorry, I should have said this, is in Photoshop, on our AO layer, we want to change our blend mode to multiply. We're not actually adding any lightness, we're just adding the shadows in. So that's a fairly important thing too. Alright, I'm going to kind of drag that up just a little farther and save that. Now we reload it, and now we've got our medium gray and a pretty good level on our ambient occlusion. This is all really kind of done to taste, but I find that people when they first get started tend to go with very heavy, very sort of meaty ambient occlusion layers that look overdone. You can kind of back off on that and be a little more subtle with it and still get the effect without calling so much attention to the fact that you baked the AO. You just want it to be sort of a subconscious thing in your model that's there, but people don't necessarily think about. They just think, wow, that looks really realistic when they see your model.